Welcome to Wright State University's Inclusive Excellence Speaker Series. Today's focus is on academic ableism and universal design. My name is Tom Webb, and I'm the Director of Disability Services at Wright State University. This is part one of a two-day workshop, and I'm delighted to have such a diverse group of people in attendance today. It's a mix of faculty, staff, students, and other members of our community. The funding for today's event was made possible thanks to a Student First Fund grant from the Wright State University Foundation. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Dolmage. Dr. Dolmage is a professor of English at the University of Waterloo and is the founding editor of the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies. His work brings together rhetoric, disability studies, and critical pedagogy in an accessible yet groundbreaking body of articles, talks, and workshops. A fierce advocate for disability rights, he is committed to publishing open access and accessible materials and helped author the International Guidelines for Accessible Electronic Books. Leading by example, Dr. Dolmage's second book, Academic Ableism, Disability and Higher Education, was published with Michigan University Press in 2017 and is available in an open access version online. I know many of us are looking forward to learning more from Dr. Dolmage over the next hour. Again, welcome to Wright State.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for the invitation, the chance to think through some of these things, and to bring them to you so that we can have a conversation. The talk will basically be broken up into three parts, based on examining disability in higher education before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. So I want to lay out some of the ways disability has been historically constructed at our universities, asking how ableism has come to kind of permeate the culture in which we work. The metaphor that I commonly use for this is the steep steps, and we'll look briefly at some examples of these steep steps as architectural realities at our schools, but also metaphorically as structures that are built into the culture and built into the curriculum. The second part of the talk will look at retrofitting, the ways that we work around inaccessible features of the social, educational, physical, and digital environment in an effort to provide access. In this part of the workshop, we'll explore how to identify retrofits, but also how to build them. This is the during COVID part of the talk in a way, and we want to examine some of the ways that we have actually quite quickly pivoted or adapted to an emergency teaching scenario. In some ways, we've advanced access in this pivot, and in other ways, as I'll show, we have not. And there are some things that we may be able to keep and other things that we really shouldn't. And finally, we're going to explore universal design, looking at how we might plan from the beginning to make our teaching as accessible as possible so that we don't have to make temporary or unsatisfactory modifications later. Hopefully, this is also the after COVID part of the talk, where we think about what we want to do to change what we want to change permanently about higher ed now that we've been offered a chance to reevaluate our priorities. So, beginning with the steep steps, I have an image for you. And this is from the Student Success Center, relatively new Student Success Center or rebuilt Student Success Center at Wright State. And it's an interior staircase. It's a cement staircase with, that's clad on two sides with metal panels that are bright kind of green, yellow-green, fluorescent color. There is a steel hand railing to the right of the stairs. The staircase goes up about 12 steps and then levels out and then goes up another flight above that. The staircase
Hey
is
Jay,
also...
we don't see the staircase. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, am I not sharing yet? I'm sorry. Thank you.
Don't see it. Sure.
Here we go. Thank you for telling me that. Okay, it's coming. All right, now can you see my first slide?
It might still be, not yet, no.
Uh-oh. I'm seeing it there.
I think you might have to use those special controls on the left-hand side.
Yeah, I am using those.
That's so weird because we just see your opening slide with the title of the presentation.
Huh. and you can't advance past that slide.
Oh, there we go.
You have it now?
I think
Yep.
I did it.
Okay.
Okay, do you want to take control then?
We'll see what happens.
Let's see it. Let's roll
We'll
with it as
adapt as we
it
go.
happens. So now you are seeing that staircase that I was describing, and this is a good test of my description skills, right? We shouldn't even need to see the slides if I'm good enough at it. The point that I left off on was that the idea for this staircase seems to me to be that it provides views outside of the building, so that when you use the staircase, you get a very interesting view of the rest of the campus, but also that as you're approaching the building, you see this staircase as one of the primary architectural features of the building, kind of floating in space in this big glass set of windows that are to the right of the staircase. So it's a beautiful staircase, right? And we'll just think about this in a few different ways. You know, your campus, just like most, has stairs, and so does my own campus at the University of Waterloo. Many of you, probably most of you, have specific associations with steps like these on campus, having traveled up them or having avoided them. Regardless, students and faculty alike recognize that steps like these have something to say. At the University of Toronto, students even participate in an annual Great Barrier Hunt. The event aims to raise awareness of accessibility issues on campus. Using the format of a scavenger hunt, participants perform an accessibility audit of U of T buildings. Such activities highlight the ways that traditional campuses are designed only for a certain range of bodies. And this is certainly the case on my own campus and at University of Toronto. But even new features like these interior stairs in your redesigned Student Success Center, they exclude students with disabilities from the key aesthetic, cultural, artistic, and intellectual centers and messages of university life. The steep steps metaphor puts forward the idea that access to the university is a movement upwards, and only the truly fit survive this climb. I want to suggest that we've mapped the university in this way as a climb up the stairs of the ivory tower for particular reasons. Not only have people with disabilities been traditionally seen as objects of study in higher education rather than as teachers and students, not only has disability been a rhetorically produced stigma which could be applied to other marginalized groups to keep them out of the university, but the university is seen as performing and kind of reliably performing the societal and cultural function of pulling some people slowly up the stairs and arranging others at the bottom of these steps. So I'm going to ask you to think about how this steep steps mentality has shaped your own education. Who and what has helped you up the stairs? Where were they steepest or most difficult for you? What pushed you back? And also, importantly, where did you start on the stairs based on your own privilege or lack of privilege? Of course, the reality is that disability is always present. There's no normal body or mind. More literally, the US is a country within which 25% of the population is affected by disability. We live in an age when, despite physical and medical efforts to avoid it, and psychological and medical efforts to disavow and pathologize it, we'll all become disabled at some point in our lives. So we all need to care about disability now. In the United States, according to the most recent data, 19.5% of students have a disability. For 40 in college and university. For 40% of these students, the disability is mental illness or depression. For 26.4% of these students, the disability or one of the disabilities is ADD or ADHD. We might also assume that many students with invisible disabilities pass, hiding their disability or attempting to overcome it because of that mentality of steep steps. As teachers, staff members, and administrators, we might recognize and celebrate the diversity of the students we teach, but we also have to recognize our roles within institutions, disciplines, and perhaps even personal pedagogical agendas in which we may seek to avoid and disavow the very idea of disability. This avoidance brings with it its own spatial metaphors, and I use the steep steps to express this. The truth is that the university sorts the population by a medicalized and legalistic definition of ability as effectively now as it ever has. Universities continue to function to keep certain groups of individuals out of the workforce and away from status positions, away from knowledge and dialogue and power, and not just through admissions. 13% of US citizens 25 and older with a disability have a bachelor's degree or higher, and this compares with 31% for those with no disability. While more students with disabilities are enrolling than in previous eras in the United States, nearly 2/3 are unable to complete their degrees within 6 years. Just 41% of students with learning disabilities complete their post-secondary education. Disabled students are also likely to have up to 60% more student debt by the time they graduate. And of course, the statistics are skewed because they only account for the students who receive accommodations. In the United States, some studies show that up to 2/3 of disabled college students don't receive accommodations simply because their colleges don't know about their disabilities. And those who do seek accommodations are likely to do so only in their third or fourth year. We have a generation of students who are much more likely to experience higher education as disabling, and yet also much less likely to seek help. In the United States, for example, while 94% of learning disabled high school students get assistance, only 17% of college students with learning disabilities do. And that's the same group of students, right? So the students have accommodations that help them in K-12, help them get into college or university. And then when they get there, only 17% of them seek that same kind of help. What's telling those students not to seek the simple resources that helped them before? It's very common for students to experience greater barriers in university than they experienced in high school. Still, thousands and thousands of students don't seek help. And so I think we have a crisis of help seeking around disability. And I think because of it, we're losing thousands of students every day. I know that enrollment at Wright State, as at many other universities, has taken a hit recently. So I don't make this claim about losing students lightly. But something is happening when students confront the metaphorical steep steps. The message that they get is that it's okay not to ask for help. At least your disability services office is not hidden away in some basement. And as we'll discuss further today, your campus is definitely more physically accessible than most. And I know that disability services professionals are trying hard to get help to students, but I think we can continue to see this trend, in part because the culture of higher education works against the ethic of help seeking. There are many reasons why students won't seek help. One of them is the economics of it, right? The most recent AHEAD, which is the Association of Higher Education and Disability survey of U.S. Disability Services Office, revealed that, quote, the average annual disability services office budget was $257,289. That's the entire office budget. That's about what a Division I assistant football coach makes. So the kicking coach makes as much in a year as the average school spends on all students with disabilities. And football coaches are also seeing their salaries climb. The same can't be said for these office budgets. The ratios at these offices in the US was 1 staff member per 80 students with disabilities. Offices of disability services are thus clearly overworked and underfunded. So we shouldn't really be surprised that the number of college and university students identified as having disabilities is below the average within the general population. The offices are working hard, but they're working above capacity, right? And the underfunding also tells the rest of the university that disability doesn't matter that much. The result then is that the steps are particularly steep for students with disabilities. Looking at these steep steps in a world in which COVID has changed how we think about buzzwords like community and even how we think about our campus space is jarring. In a world in which the prevalence of overt and systemic racism needs to be foregrounded in all that we do, we also need to understand that these steep steps disproportionately impact students of color. Many of us have been working hard to address racism on campus, and I know that this has been a widespread issue at schools across North America. There have been specific incidents, but there are also systemic issues, and these intersect with disability. For example, we know that African American males are disproportionately placed into categories of special education that are associated with extremely poor outcomes at the K-12 level, something people have defined as the school to prison pipeline. Yet education researcher Joy Banks has shown that African American students with disabilities experience difficulty accessing disability support services and accommodations at colleges and universities. So for the same group of students, a disability diagnosis at K-12 can be hastily applied and in a way is dangerous, right? And yet at the post-secondary level, it's so much more difficult to get. and then there are large barriers to getting help. The other thing I think we want to think about in terms of these steep steps is just the work that students have to do on campus to get the help that they need. Interpreting the extra time and space and barriers that minority students may need to navigate, and thus that teachers need to anticipate, William Sedlacek suggests that minority students have to develop specific skills and expend considerable energy coping with racism, looking for allies, and forming their own community, protecting their identities. It might be argued that these are tasks that require strategic silence or reticence, cunning, code switching, self-care, and a wide range of abstract and contextually varying and difficult skills. And those skills do not always sync with traditional teaching and assessment. At the same time, students in majority groups can concentrate on the things that we do test and assess for, right? Test taking, reasoning, straightforward academic skills. The result is that multiple studies have shown that minority students, specifically African American and Hispanic students, exert more effort and are more engaged on campus than white peers, but they get lower grades. Teachers absolutely have to understand that these differences change the social and educational geography on campus. They impose other steps. There was a recent opinion piece published in Inside Higher Ed by psychologist and psychometrician Robert J. Sternberg, who argued that, quote, COVID-19 has taught us something important about intelligence, which he goes on to define as, quote, the ability to adapt to the environment. In that calculus, we have to see disabled students, students of color, and other students from a wide range of backgrounds that aren't the dominant background, as in fact, incredibly hardworking and highly intelligent. The labor and expertise they exert just to survive in higher education is remarkable. But we don't reward these things in any way, shape, or form. We ask them to remain invisible, and we go ahead and reward traditional students for doing the traditional things that come as second nature to them. And that's part of how the steep steps work. Some people actually have an escalator. So we need to look at campus differently. I'll give you an interesting example from my own campus at the University of Waterloo. Two students stuck at home during the pandemic created an interactive map of our campus as part of an art therapy project. And I'll just advance to the next slide. It's this mapping tiers project. I don't know if you can see it or if somebody else needs to help me advance it. Tom,
There we go. We're good.
Okay, great. So the map shows where students have cried on the University of Waterloo campus as part and gives them the opportunity to share the story behind the tears. So in this slide, it's difficult to see, but it's a black map. It actually is the campus of the University of Waterloo. There are blue and orange dots all around the campus where students have tagged the map as a place where they've cried. And then when you click on any of those little dots or links, you can read the little story of what led to the tears. It's a really compelling project, although I'm pretty sure that university administration, I'm not sure if they were going to like its focus, especially because it was covered in the Globe and Mail, which is a national newspaper in Canada, something like the New York Times for Canada. Excuse me. Especially when there's been a student suicide and student mental health crisis on campus going on nearly a decade. From the CBC story on this project, the students said that, quote, realizing other people had cried about similar things on campus helped them feel less isolated and offered a new perspective for when students eventually return to campus and pass all these places, now knowing that people have cried there. Quote, we'll just have a greater degree of empathy for everybody, said one of the creators, Leslie Zinn, and recognize that everybody is going through their own situations. The pair plan to keep updating the map as more submissions come in, and they hope it starts conversations about mental health. They also plan to share the source code so that this can be done at other universities. So I want to ask, what would this map look like on your own campus? I think, as educators, we're forced to ask ourselves that. Could we utilize a map like this as a filter for seeing the steep steps around us, and the affect of those steep steps around us, and building empathy for one another? One of the ways that ableism works, I'm certain, is that we're obscured from understanding many of the barriers that students face on our campuses, in our programs, and in our professions. I think this goes for faculty and graduate students doubly. We don't even try to imagine the ableism experienced by faculty instructors or graduate student instructors. The result is a culture of silence and passing. And I think the result is the attrition or the loss of disabled teachers and researchers. The steep steps are in place for students, but they're firmly in place and extremely steep for us as teachers as well. This also signals the transition point in this talk, moving away from talking about disability and access before COVID to what has happened since COVID. So I'd like us to take some time to think about and to identify some of the barriers that exist as well in the online environment we're currently working in. Excuse me. The truth is that steep steps have been a huge part of back to campus planning around COVID-19 as well. All of a sudden, administrators have to look at their buildings entirely differently. Sorry, excuse me. In 6-foot increments that don't easily fit in crowded stairwells and don't fit at all in elevators. And the steps of going back together have forever changed. Who will have a choice about, excuse me, teaching or learning in person on campus? Who will get to choose to work and learn from home? What social and student-centered spaces will replace physical ones, like the steps or the Student Success Center, with the same demands of student time and productivity, but without the overhead costs of buildings and classrooms? What regimes of individualization, self-responsibilization, and personal wellness are being put in place? I'm seeing this a lot, that the responsibility for being well is placed onto students. It's not a responsibility that's taken seriously by the institution. And what new regimes of control and surveillance have been built or are being built? For example, I want to give you another screenshot here, and I apologize again. It's a very blurry screenshot. It's a set of online test guidelines from from Wilfrid Laurier University just down the street from me. So let me describe the slide. It says that students must, so there's 7 pages of these guidelines that students are given when they're taking an online test over the last year. And it says that students may not use touchpads or touchscreens. They have to use only an external mouse, keep their upper body in view for the entire exam, keep all work surfaces visible by arranging a webcam to view them. And if they need to go to the washroom, and I'm not kidding about this, it actually says they have to shout, "I need to go to the washroom and I will come back quickly," into their camera. All of this just so that the instructor can give a test that's not been properly adapted to online learning. The attitude towards students situates them all as potential cheaters, not all as potential learners, community members, or co-constructors of knowledge. And those pages of instructions, all of which must be followed or else the test result will be invalidated, they're a perfect distillation of the ways we've adapted our steep steps to COVID, maintaining, retaining, and adding to them, rather than trying to remove them. As a recent article on students with disabilities and COVID-19 concluded, barriers have not been removed, but barriers have changed. I also want us to have a quick look at the next slide. This is created by the University of Disabled Students Organization at the University of Iowa, and it's a map of institutional barriers. It's a kind of infographic, and what we see is an iceberg. So at the very top of the iceberg, we see the part that's sticking out of the water, and it's labeled Student Disability Services Located in Dorm Basement. That's the visible presence of disability on campus. But underneath the water, all the other parts of the iceberg are labeled as well. And they include mental health stigma, to courses seldom inclusively designed, to exclusion from diversity programs and initiatives, to minimal administrative advocacy. And this calls to mind the idea that as Disabled in Higher Ed, which is a Twitter an account that really I recommend people follow, as they've stated, higher ed is often not better ed, but higher barrier education. Another way of looking at this is to access the "Why Disabled People Drop Out" hashtag on Twitter, a conversation begun in April 2019 by Kate West of Oxford Brookes University. And tomorrow, for those who can attend the workshop, we'll structure some of our discussion around identifying and removing these barriers on your campus. Okay, so I'm moving into the second, and that's the hashtag there, "Why Disabled People Drop Out," that I would recommend. And I'm going to move on to the second part of the second sort of image for us is of a retrofit, right? And the image I have here is another set of stairs that are on the exterior of the Student Success Center, or I believe leading to the Student Success Center. It's actually a really beautiful set of stairs with a switchback ramp that's kind of built into it. And I found this to be a really interesting example of a retrofit because instead of having just a regular staircase, there's a ramp that allows you to cross back and forth through the stairs to create another pathway to get into the building. So it does make these stairs accessible. But I also would suggest that this is a lot of concrete, right? And there would be a way to design this that removed all the stairs altogether, didn't make the ramp secondary to the stairs, and so that everybody could simply use that ramp entrance. The point being, most of the time, retrofits like this, they're around the back of the building, right? I don't exactly know the history of this ramp, but I know that it's been held up nationally as an example of creativity around physical access. More often than not, the ramps to buildings are hidden around the back, leading into frayed entrances. And they're just the first step of a complicated dance through physical spaces to find the hidden but accessible ways to get into them and move through them. While the stairs never get changed, right? They're central to the architecture, the sociality, and the flow through a space in its most important areas. The funny thing about ramps is that they rarely ever replace stairs. We have ramps, most usually in academic architecture, so that we can keep the stairs, so that we can keep the old historic building, right? And that's a little bit of what's going on in this image from your campus, I think. I think it's actually a powerful metaphor about accessibility in higher education. So much of the access we create doesn't replace the old inaccessible way of doing things. It just creates a longer path alongside the old one. The retrofitted ramp allows the old exclusive space or practice to continue to be dominant and central. A retrofit like this is a sort of cure, but it's half-hearted. And so it begins by negating disability. It ends up only partially succeeding, thus leaving many people with disabilities in difficult positions. Too often we react to diversity instead of planning for it. We acknowledge that our students come from different places and that they're headed in different directions, yet this does little to alter the vectors of our own pedagogy. Most often, the only time disability is spoken or written about in class is in the final line of the syllabus when students are referred to the Office of Disability Services should they desire assistance. The message to students is that disability is a supplementary concern, and then that it's not really the teacher's concern, not really a part of the course, it's at the back door of the syllabus. Having that statement there allows us not to change the dominant way of doing things, regardless how inaccessible that dominant way is. I'll give you an example. You know, that long list of test taking rules for those students taking an online class down the road from me here in Waterloo. I mean, there's probably a disability statement on that syllabus too. But imagine how much work the Disability Services Office would have to do to work around that unbelievably inaccessible test taking protocol. The point is, we have things like that all over the physical space of the university and all through its processes. And too often we build accessibility in, but in a way that allows us not to change the inaccessible things that we do, right? To me, this also calls up the unexpected status of disabled students. As Stone and Crooks have argued, disabled academics are unexpected workers in an able-bodied work environment. Altogether, too many schools and programs have no expectation of disabled students enrolling, and thus no plans for how to adapt the curriculum when they arrive, let alone before they arrive. But this adds up to thousands of unexpected students, and we can't ethically have these same expectations anymore. I'll tell you a quick story about Miami University of Ohio that I unearthed when I was there, going through old papers in the archive. On more than one occasion, when disability came up in discussions there, for instance, after the GI Bill increased access to higher education for many disabled veterans, Miami administrators suggested that they could just tell disabled Ohio students to go to Wright State, which was more accessible. But this was also a way to resist changing anything about the architecture or attitudes at Miami. It's very typical Miami. So this is part of Wright State's legacy too, as a campus that is more accessible than most. Holding up your access has been a way for other Ohio schools to resist changing. And that happens between schools, but retrofits and the creation of a few accessible spaces or certain forms of accessibility on campus, or maybe one really accessible feature or building, those things get held up as ways, they serve the purpose of allowing other spaces or processes on your own campus to resist change as well. So as a result of this special status for disability and accommodation, wherein the channels for access are kept so narrow, faculty and students, they don't have positive attitudes about accommodations. Students report negative attitudes from faculty when they disclose disabilities. Faculty and students have, in general, not had very much contact with disabled people, and this lack of contact leads to bias and ableism. Students with and without both learning disabilities and psychological disabilities view them as insurmountable problems or as correlated with low ability, even though professionals don't see the disabilities this way. Students who do work to secure accommodations come up against what Annika Conrad calls access fatigue, as well as what Margaret Price calls conflicts of access, while they struggle to develop for themselves what Neil Simpkins calls access transfer. And the research clearly shows how large a cognitive load disabled students have to carry. The process, in the words of Lauren Berlant, marks some students out for wearing out. Today, new cognitive and emotional demands are ensuring that we will face an epidemic of student retention that mirrors the disproportionate and discriminatory impact that the COVID epidemic is having on disabled people. What will the long-term impact be of failing to consider equity and accessibility in the decision-making around our shift to online teaching or our shift back to face-to-face teaching? We can't act surprised when we're asked to adapt and accommodate our teaching for disabled students, but instead we don't plan for this, and it's become okay to think about this later. Moreover, unfortunately, those most likely not to do the work of dismantling ableism are those in non-precarious and secure positions. I mean this literally. Non-tenure faculty, specifically non-tenure track women identified faculty, are those most likely to accommodate as well as those more likely to adopt universal design principles in their teaching. Younger faculty are more likely to accommodate than older, more established faculty. But those most in need of the dismantling of ableism are kept away from the opportunity even pointed out, or kept in positions in which their objectives can be effectively diffused. And those with privilege are least likely to risk this privilege to create opportunities for others. I think it gets back to summarize, I think it gets back to the steep steps mentality. If we believe in the steep steps as a meritocracy that's fair and that's working well, because it gave us privilege, right? It's very difficult to try to take that apart, because doing so means we have to admit that we came by our privilege through an unfair system. It's really difficult to get people to do that. The other thing I'd say is that retrofits are a lot of the time, the retrofits and accessibility measures that we have, they can actually enhance and rationalize exclusion. To begin with, there are such a limited range of accommodations offered. More than 3/4 of the accommodations offered are the exact same accommodation, extended time on tests and exams. Testing in higher education is a significant creator of barriers, in particular for people with learning disabilities and mental health related disabilities. And it doesn't make sense to think that these students will experience anything like these barriers in the environment outside of school, where high stakes testing like experiences are extremely rare. There will be other barriers that they need to be prepared for and learn about, right? But instead, we spend so much time learning about and dealing with the barriers of something that's very synthetic, which is a high stakes testing. Likewise, the accommodations that these students will need in a professional capacity are unlikely to look anything like the accommodations they get in testing heavy classrooms. And that's a huge problem and a huge wasted opportunity. Something I hope, again, that we can talk more about tomorrow, and that hopefully we can come up with some creative responses. The truth is, I'm sure there are people in the audience today who are thinking, I never give tests or exams, or I never give them in a timed way. And I think that's good. But there's a responsibility baked into that as well, right? Because we know that disability services offices are offering that accommodation 3/4 of the time, right? And you maybe get that accommodation as something that you're told to do when you get a letter, right? And if you don't give tests or exams, what accommodation can you offer for the kind of teaching that you do to make sure that the ramp that's offered to students doesn't lead students nowhere, right? We need a much broader repertoire of accommodations. In writing classrooms like the one I work in, where I rarely give tests and I rarely lecture, I know I have to work to expand the range of accommodations that can be offered to students. Universities talk all the time about really innovative teaching methods that move beyond lecturing, testing, and rote learning, but continuing to work with a really narrow range of accommodations while at the same time advocating for a broader range of learning experiences becomes really problematic, right? We need to allow for an environment in which students can claim difference without fear of discrimination, and that environment has to include disability. Further, disability cannot be seen just as something one person diagnoses in another. It has to be seen as socially negotiated, and people with disabilities have to be given agency, right? They need to be the agents of that negotiations. What are some of the ways that we do this already? What are some ways that in higher education we've taken accommodations that were made over time and turned them into mainstream pedagogical techniques? There's a metaphor that I use that so many accommodations are like Las Vegas. What happens for one student in one class stays with that one student in that one class. And then that student has to negotiate in the next class something all over again and hope that that succeeds, right? And that's exhausting, but it's also really very regressive. Um, my belief is that every accommodation that we give should cue us to change the classroom. Um, every time there's a student who has a need, whether that's for an accommodation or any sort of a need, that's a cue that we can change our classroom because we should expect that kind of difference and that need to be present again, right? I think we've had an opportunity over the last 12 or 13 months to redesign higher education in ways we never have before. Yet nobody was really talking about accessibility as part of that process. Universities spent a lot of time investing in surveillance test proctoring software, a lot more time doing that than developing alternatives to outdated teaching models that relied on testing. I also think that there's some irony that the ableist demands for physical attendance and participation that teachers used to cling to so tightly have now been so easily left behind. Asking to have, I'll just say for a lot of people with episodic or chronic disabilities, being present in class every single day at a given time is difficult. And a lot of those people asked in the past to be able to have a more flexible policies around attendance and participation. And there was no way that they were going to be given them, right? And yet now all of a sudden, everybody is flexible, right? We have entire conferences that are entirely online. And all of our classes are delivered in that way. And there's some irony there, right? Because disabled people can hardly count the number of times they were denied those things and maybe even stigmatized for asking about them in the past. My hope is that those kinds of ableist demands don't just slide back into place. And I believe that the advocacy of disabled people needs to be what determines this future. There needs to be thought given about the new ableist demands that are sliding into the place of old demands, right? But we also need to think about accessibility as we pivot. How will we need to retrofit our teaching in ways that remove barriers as we pivot back and return to campus? Okay, so just like the Three Little Pigs story, or a fairy tale, I'm supposed to now give you the perfect example, right? We've talked about steep steps, we talked about retrofits, and now this is supposed to be the perfect temperature of oatmeal, or the most comfortable bed, or the house made of bricks, I guess, in that metaphor. But I do want us to talk a little bit about universal design today, scaffolding towards a bigger and more fulsome discussion of this moving forward. I want us to transition to thinking about what accessible teaching might look like someday after COVID. I'll tell you a quick little story about that, because I think that educational practices that seem like they've simply always existed, even something like letter grades, started hardly more than a century ago. And you know, the story with letter grades is that they paralleled a system imposed on the American Meat Packers Association. Excuse me. At first, the meat packers objected because they argued meat was too complex to be judged by letter grades. But the factory assembly line provided inspiration for things like the standardized bubble test, which was adopted as a means of sorting students for admission to college. Such practices help to make education seem efficient, measurable, and meritocratic, but they tended to screen out collaborative approaches to problem solving. And yet somehow we've held on to them for a long time and held tight. This despite the fact that they've not always been around, and despite the fact that becoming a teacher, a scientist, a doctor, a lawyer, a poet, or an engineer is nothing like becoming a meat packer. The meat packers fought back, but we have not, right? And we still teach very much on a kind of factory model, right? Our classes take place in little 50-minute or 120-minute chunks. All the learning needs to be captured in that time. This gives off the idea that what we're doing is really efficient and regimented and meritocratic, even though these processes are not the way we've always taught, right? Tomorrow I want to give some examples of some of the ways that I myself really held on to really traditional teaching techniques for a long time before I recognized and realized some of the different options that I would have to change what I was doing, right? I think that in the last 12 or 13 months, we've come to understand some things about education in a different way, simply by virtue of the fact that we're learning differently than we did before COVID, right? So for example, we've all come to understand things like Zoom fatigue, but I want us to challenge us to expand on this. Why is it that we think that students are only fatigued and unexcited by hours on screen? There are other ways we need to reconceptualize the amount of attention we ask for from students and the type of attention we ask for from students. How can we permanently pull back on testing and use that energy for teaching? How can we assess less and teach more? How can we prioritize engagement and connection and not be so worried about conveying content? In the winter term of 2020, most Ontario universities allowed students to choose credit or non-credit grades instead of numerical grades. Then, for some strange reason, even though fall of 2020 was much more stressful and difficult, this offer was rescinded. But we should have been asking what grades ever did for us. Why did we let them back in our classrooms? There were also major changes in the assessment of teachers. We got extended tenure clocks, we got exempted from, or we got adapted annual performance reviews. We can look at the data and it shows that research output for example, female identified faculty has taken a huge hit, one that will likely ripple into the next decade. This should help us understand that we were never on a level playing field to begin with, and that neither are students. We removed time testing and we altered our exams, but we only did that for one term. And now universities are spending millions of dollars on complicated test proctoring services just so that we can give the same old assessments. And I guess the question is, should any of the forms of Fordist, factory assembly line assessment that hung around since the mid-20th century be allowed to hang around any further, right? And so I'm getting to this third metaphor and architectural concept of universal design. The example I want to give is of the tunnels here at Wright State. You know, they're famous. I remember hearing about them 20 years ago. And in the estimable New Nobility magazine Wheels on Campus rankings, in which Wright State finished 4th in 2020, and that's a big deal. The tunnels are described, quote, as legendary among the Ohio disability community, and especially important to wheelchair users who need to get to classes and activities around campus. And, you know, maybe the tunnels were first for bringing power and water from building to building, but early on in their development, the university, as you know, realized what they could do for access. From your own website, quote, they were designed to make the campus more accessible to persons with disabilities. And the tunnel system provides a convenience to all in bad weather. And this is one of the best examples of universal design then that I've seen in all of North America. In adapting the tunnels for use by students, and in the image you're seeing here, you see a broad panoramic view of these tunnels And they're full of students doing all kinds of things, talking to one another, comparing notes, sitting and resting, walking from one space to the next. In the foreground of the photo, there's a kind of blurry image of one person walking that gives the idea that they're a space for movement, they're a space for community, they're a social space and an educational space. And that they're not just a space for disability, even though they provide accessibility. Now, the tunnels are essential to the lore of the university, its legends and its stories, and disability is at the center of that, not around the back. And that's really unique. So universal design, as Ronald Mace wrote, is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So there's no need for retrofits when you build this way from the beginning. Universal design was at first an architectural movement, right? And we've expanded that to make it a pedagogical movement as well. And in that pedagogical movement, there are three basic factors, three basic approaches. One is multiple means of representation to give learners various ways of acquiring knowledge and information. Two is multiple means of expression to provide learners alternatives for demonstrating what they know. And three is multiple means of engagement to tap into learners' interests, offer appropriate challenges, and increase motivation. We're going to talk a lot about that tomorrow if you're able to come back. Wright State is far ahead of many other schools in advocating for universal design and in educating faculty about how it works. And I'm interested in hearing more about how this is going, right? The idea has been that a critical reinscription and remapping of social and educational space was necessary, and that disability was going to be necessary for the redesign of space, right? I guess the question is, imagine if we conceptualized all of the structures at Wright State, all of the architecture, all of the processes, all of the social space, all of the pedagogy that we do, and all of the curriculum. What if we built it all like the tunnels, right? From the beginning, if we planned for the broadest spectrum of students, right, and that we thought of those students as moving across embodiments throughout the course of their time on campus and the course of their lives. Steve Jacobs, when writing about the electronic curb cut effect, suggests that many of the things we now take for granted, technologies that improve everyone's quality of life, were originally designed specifically and only for people with disabilities. If disability hadn't broadened our conception of access to technology, made it more universal, we wouldn't have things like the typewriter, the stereo recorder, the transistor radio, flatbed scanner, but also just every cool thing that your phone does, right, is based on, at some point, having been a niche and expensive technology that was just for disabled people. And now we know that they're really useful for everybody, right? That's in part how universal design works. And for the last decade, I've been working on creating a long list of universal design ideas. I call it places to start because that's how I want fellow teachers to approach these things, as things to try or experiment with in their own teaching. So in our discussion tomorrow, I hope we can hear some examples of accessible teaching that people already use or that you've experienced in the classroom. And I think we need to get together and we need to share these ideas. I said earlier that every time there's an accommodation, that should change how we teach so that the accommodation maybe isn't needed in the same way in the future, right? And I'm hoping that some of the sharing that we can do tomorrow. I think that first of all, I want to thank you for your time listening to me talk tomorrow. As I said, tomorrow, I'm hoping I'll do a lot less talking and I'll get to hear a lot more from you all. I have some challenges for you and some structure around thinking about steep steps and thinking about retrofitting and talking about universal design. So I really hope to get that chance to connect with you tomorrow. I think that we can all agree that before COVID, our schools had too many unnecessary barriers in place for students. During COVID, we all viewed and experienced new barriers, or we saw the old ones, we're beginning to see the old ones from new perspectives. And now we have a chance to build something different. Thanks for your time, and we still have some time for questions today and some interaction. So I'll let maybe Tom take over that part of things.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jay. If there's any questions, I would ask that you put them in the chat or actually the Q&A window that you have there, and we can Make sure those get read aloud. And if there aren't any
You have
questions,
one
okay,
question there
sure.
from Sean Pollock. You talk about universal design of curriculum. Please tell us who is leading in this area, key resources for faculty along the lines of your places to start.
Sure. I can give a few different examples. So some of the people doing, I mean, there are universities that have had national funding to do this work. Ohio State University and University of Washington are both places that do this really well. And they give some examples of what the universal design might look like in the classroom. The problem for me is that often those things kind of look like a checklist and they're broad, right? So they may not apply directly to a lab situation or experiential learning or particular pedagogical technique like peer review. In my examples, I'm trying to be more specific and granular, and those specific and granular examples are maybe a little harder to get to. Um, Johns Hopkins University, they do a really interesting thing there with universal design where they have faculty who are universal design fellows, and their job is basically to promote universal design across campus by giving teaching demonstrations, visiting other people's classrooms, helping them build their syllabi. I think a model like that is really interesting and good too. In terms of, maybe that's something I can get back to you with, especially if you can come back tomorrow by providing some links to some other articles and literature around universal design for teaching. The other thing I'd say is that it's a little bit underexplored in university, but there's a ton of it in K to 12. Most K to 12 educators know what universal design is. They've gone to workshops, they've done that kind of work. So we still have a fair amount of work to do to talk about it in the higher ed sector. Tomorrow I'll give you even more examples though. We'll go through some of the things that I do. Hopefully other people can share some of their examples as well.
Thank you. From Sarah McGinley, we have, how can people low in the hierarchy push for change?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I identified as being difficult, right? I think that the one of the pieces for me is um, that we listen to students, right? If you can show that you're responsive to student needs, then that justifies a lot of the things that I'm arguing for here. I also think I just think we need to build into our system ways to reward teaching. And the unfortunate thing is that most of the time for junior faculty, for adjunct faculty, they don't really get rewarded for teaching. Our universities don't do a lot of, in merit review, in tenure decisions. The big thing is research, and it's not necessarily teaching. So I think we need to build into the system structures for rewarding teaching. And we need to kind of prioritize teaching. And one of the ways to do that, I think, is by linking it with research. But the question, I don't know what the answer is to your question because it's not an individual answer. It's not something that can be changed by an individual. It's a systemic structure that makes it more difficult for those people to argue for change. The responsibility really is on senior faculty. It really is on the administrators who are attending today, right? To empower younger faculty, to empower faculty who don't have the same status positions to do the kind of terrific teaching that they know how to do and to be rewarded for it. I know that's probably a pretty unsatisfying answer.
Another question from Julie Williams. How can we help students, staff, and faculty with disabilities manage return to institution when they have discovered the increased access they experienced in a virtual world? Suddenly the narrative is becoming a return to quote unquote normal.
Yes. Yeah, and there are things that we need to return to and things that we don't, right? But to me, I honestly believe the model, and it's a sustainable model, but the model is to pay disabled students and staff to consult and have them at the table in the planning for back to campus. They just need to be listened to. They need to be heard from. They need to be consulted. And I think the model would be to have a consultancy group that looks at back to campus. For a wide variety of there are more reasons than just what happens in the classroom. Disabled people know and understand risk around health in ways that able-bodied people will never understand, right? So going back to campus is not the same thing for somebody who, for instance, is immune compromised as it is for somebody who's not. And we can't plan for a safe return to campus for anybody unless we speak to and consult with and get the expertise of disabled people. Those are actually the people who should be leading the discussions around moving back to campus, or should at least be at the table. It gets back to the metaphors that I gave. If we listen to disabled people around that, there would be a beneficial effect for everybody, simply because disabled people knew and understood so many of the conditions around this pandemic in intimate ways that other people didn't until they were forced to, you know? And so that's what I've been saying whenever I'm asked a question like that, and it's something I'm lobbying for on my own campus.
Let's see here. Not a question, but a statement from Tammy Carrig. Just a note, thank you for this. I'm unable to join tomorrow. We will be recording tomorrow's session as well and posting it on the ODS YouTube channel. You can visit our webpage on the Wright website in order to get access to the YouTube channel. From Susan Simones, do you have resources for scientists teaching students with anxiety, ADD, ADHD in science majors?
Yes, I mean the list of universal design ideas for teaching does deal specifically with for instance, lab settings. It deals with really large format classes, which I know a lot of folks in science are dealing with. Right? They may not have the same affordances as somebody who's teaching a class that's capped at 50. So their classes may all be capped at 250. So that's about. I think I could offer specific examples if the question were even more specific about, a particular thing, but that's maybe the best I can do without more information.
Thank you. Over in the chat from Sarah Bundish, I'm sorry I butchered your name there. What are important ways that admissions offices can encourage students to seek out the necessary resources as they transition from the K-12 system?
Yeah, I think one of the points I hope I made clearly is that this issue around help seeking is not going away. And at Wright State, I think you have a huge advantage in already having a reputation for being more accessible, but that should extend to all aspects of the experience, including admissions. I'm hoping that you have some statement for folks around alternative admissions processes that take into account the fact that students may not have been accommodated before they came to university, but also that accounts for, I gave that metaphor of the steep steps. When you come up to most universities, that's what you see is the steep steps, right? For disabled students, they see those steps and then somebody tells them, well, there's another entrance for you around the back. That's the accessible entrance. But how do you build an entrance to the university with that universal design principle in mind, right? That doesn't assume that students are not disabled, right? Doesn't assume and act surprised when disabled students do come, right? But lays it all out in the open. That gets down to things like campus tours as well. Are they truly accessible? So I think from the ground up, from the very beginning, students need to be told where the resources are, but there also needs to be an effort to destigmatize asking for help. I mean, the data, the national surveys for student engagement, it's really alarming because the students are truly experiencing university as more disabling than they did before, significantly than they did in previous years, and they're less likely to seek help. So the university that figures out how to destigmatize that help, right? How to conceptualize for parents and for students that they are a place where it's going to be okay for part of their identity to be that they do need that help. I think those universities are going to have a huge advantage. I think, for example, that parents are looking at universities differently as places that do have a responsibility to care for young people differently than they did before. And that the universities that don't do that well, it's going to be noticeable, and that their students and parents are going to vote with their applications, and they will not apply to those universities.
I see where we're a few minutes over, so we're going to go
Sure.
ahead and wrap up. And any questions that maybe were still out there that we didn't get to, we'll make sure to include in tomorrow your workshop. And of course, that will be recorded. So if you're not able to attend tomorrow, you can at least rewatch that and get the answer to your question as well. There's also a request for the links to the places people have cried, if there's anything out there that we can provide, so we can make sure people get that in the replay.
Okay,
Uh,
and I'm just going to do one more thing
sure,
here. Oh, and maybe I can't send it, but maybe someone else can do it for me. If you can just throw my email address, Dolmage@UWaterloo, up. There's a
sure.
couple questions that just came in. If those folks don't mind just sending me that question as an email, I'm really happy to engage and respond to them by email.
Sure, absolutely. Get that in the chat. Okay, that is now in the chat for folks to grab. Give them a quick second so we don't shut the screen down on them. But thank you, Dr. Dolmage, for your time today. This has been incredibly informative and a lot of food for thought, I think, for many of us. So we look forward to having you with us tomorrow at 1 o'clock, same channel. But make sure that you have registered if you haven't already for the second day. The best way to find that is to look at the Wright State press release that has the 2 active links in case you're wondering how to do that. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.